Venezuelan Ozark, the Bolivian criminal enterprise. In this report, collected from open sources, the author reveals a slew of money laundering schemes run out of the Venezuelan regime. If you thought that what we have here is a proxy war between the United States and a host of bad actors, you aren't necessarily incorrect, but it's important to note how much money is at stake if the regime fails. The amount of dirty money skullduggery working out of that riches-to-rags country is astounding and should be noted. Before we get into this fantastic report, let's note that socialism, in its current and easily predictable disastrous failure and collapse in Venezuela, is a show of a morally bankrupt ideology and system. When all power is given to the state, and the state can do no wrong, the state will act with impunity. This isn't a matter of a perfect system being corrupted by the nature of man, but rather a system that defies nature. No system is to be held in such high regard and esteem that it is above man. Indeed, James Madison noted that if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. End quote. Unlike the American system of checks and balances on the state to control itself and its own power, socialism in reality is an elitist power grab for a new sloth of slave owners done in the name of the people. A system that insists it is liberating the people whilst enslaving it is just playing cheap wordopoly with its staunch true believers who would rather buy the utopian fantasy than the bloody reality. Its true believers, desperate and hungrily filled with promises of coveted spoils of their neighbors, can never seem to get their feet back on the ground after buying into the deluded dream. No matter how many times history snakes bites on the throat, they cling to utopia, even raising their soft pink throats to the heavens with closed eyes so the serpent may easily slither up their flesh, coil, and dine. Rather than admitting folly, quote, they live upon their vindictive pride like a starving man in the desert sucking blood out of his own body. End quote, Dostoevsky. Socialism is corruption. One cannot corrupt thievery. Theft is already corrupt. The notion of no individual private property is morally bankrupt. The notion of stealing your fellow countryman's private property is corruption. Socialism is corruption. Corruption, thy name, is socialism. Venezuelan Ozark, the Bolivian criminal enterprise. In 1998, the Venezuelan people elected Hugo Chavez, initiating a regional movement known as the Bolivarian Revolution. In an effort to isolate the United States and promote its socialism for the 21st century political project, Chavez systematically consolidated power in the executive branch. He, in turn, transformed PDVSA, the Venezuelan oil company, into a multi-billion-dollar regional enterprise operating in concert with sympathetic political leaders, economic elites, and criminal organizations. While Chavez led the project, he was aided by the political leadership in Cuba, Nicaragua, Bolivia, Ecuador, Suriname, and El Salvador. Over the past 20 years, the criminal network grew to encompass several dozen individuals and hundreds of front companies. Nicolas Maduro then warmly inherited this criminal regime in 2013 after Chavez's death. 20 years after the political project's inception, the network spans the globe from El Salvador to the United States, from Russia to Hong Kong, and across several offshore financial havens in between. Yet even after the United States has sanctioned hundreds of individuals and entities on charges like drug trafficking and money laundering, Maduro continues to serve as Venezuela's de facto leader. The result of this criminal regime culminated in a Venezuelan economy that shrunk by more than 50%, while at least 10.5% of the Venezuelan population now lives as refugees. This increasingly visible crisis imposes enormous costs on regional neighbors. Meanwhile, the illicitly laundered funds undermine the rule of law and democracy, wreak havoc on legal economies, strengthen corrupt autocratic regimes, and create spaces where transnational organized criminal networks thrive. This report highlights the scale of what we call the Bolivian Joint Criminal Enterprise. Here we highlight some of the criminal typologies used by the network and explore the wider impacts of this network's actions. The brief compiles fieldwork conducted over 5 years in 11 countries and arguments this quantitative analysis with open-source research and data analysis. Ultimately, we argue that the Bolivian Joint Criminal Enterprise is not a single entity, but rather a network of allied companies, regional structures, and historically linked individuals operating across the globe. Unless the network is attacked from multiple points simultaneously, the alliance will survive and morph into a more dispersed and sophisticated operation. On July 26, 2018, 12 individuals tied to Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA, were charged in the Southern District of Florida with conspiracy to launder $1.2 billion from the oil company through U.S. banks, brokerage firms, and real estate investment companies. The criminal complaint detailed at least one tool in the Venezuelan government's criminal toolbox to move significant sums of money to safe harbor over the last decade. While the complaint and its subsequent convictions are important, this case represents only one facet of the manner in which funds have been illicitly moved by state structures since the Bolivarian Revolution was launched with Hugo Chávez's election. With the guidance of that cigar-jumping maggot Fidel Castro, Hugo Chávez was elected to be Venezuela's president in 1998 as a folk hero following his failed 1992 coup. Chávez's Bolivarian project was from its inception an effort to create a new economic and political model for Latin America, while simultaneously engaging in political and economic warfare against the influence of the United States. This vision for creating the 21st century socialism included creating, at least in spirit, a political union comprised of Venezuela, Colombia, Panama, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. He ran on a highly popular anti-corruption and populist platform and viewed Venezuela's vast oil wealth as a financial means to this anticipated political end. With oil prices high and a broad disillusionment with the region's historic ruling elite, Chávez seized the moment to launch his populist movement across the region. In doing so, between 2005 and 2010, he successfully helped finance the presidential campaigns of like-minded radical populist authoritarian strongmen. These leaders included Evo Morales in Bolivia, Rafael Correa in Ecuador, Mel Zelaya in Honduras, Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, Mauricio Funes, financed by José Luis Moreno in El Salvador, and Desi Botros in Suriname. Chávez also maintained strong relationship with the leftist Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva government in Brazil and the radical populist government of Cristina Fernández de Kirchner in Argentina. It is no coincidence that most of the Bolivarian member states' leaders also shared histories of fighting in support of far-left armed guerrilla forces. While the Bolivarian Revolution institutionally began in 1998, the roots of this movement began decades earlier with Nicaragua's Sandinistas National Liberation Front, the FSLN, El Salvador's Fabrindo Martí National Liberation Front, the FMLN, the Cuban Revolution, and the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, otherwise known as FARC. No, not FART or FARC. FARC. F-A-R-C. Decades later, the memories and relationships developing during these civil conflicts brought a deep bond of trust among the newly empowered leaders. Chávez's stature in the Bolivian group was derived in part from his military experience and guerrilla ideology, but mostly from his willingness to spend billions of the now national oil company PDVSA dollars across the hemisphere. This alliance of Bolivarian states, together with the FARC, have coalesced into what we define as the Bolivian Joint Criminal Enterprise, or a consortium of criminalized states and non-state actors working in concert with shared objectives. This joint criminal enterprise has not only taken billions of dollars from Venezuelan state coffers, but also used PDVSA as the central structure for money laundering and corruption through the region. The criminal portfolio used by those in this movement has continued to diversify as oil prices dropped and PDVSA's production stalled. Such conditions forced incoming President Nicolas Maduro to rely even more on activities like cocaine trafficking and illicit gold production. But even with PDVSA's decline, the regime continues to function as a criminal operation. This report offers an overview of a facet of the complex global and frequently state-sponsored criminal enterprise. We base our findings on 5 years of field research and document collection across 11 countries, as well as an open-source data mining and link analysis. We argue that the Bolivarian Joint Criminal Enterprise should be understood as a network of networks, not as an isolated set of unrelated activities in different Latin American countries. In total, we identified 181 individuals and 176 companies operating in at least 26 countries. The sum of this criminal action is not fully known, but recent investigations by a Latin American journalist consortium found that Venezuela siphoned $28 billion out of PDVSA. $28 billion. We have traced at least $10 billion of that in Venezuela-related funds that moved through this criminal network between 2007 and 2018. $28 billion. Ultimately, we argue that the most difficult challenge to dismantling the Bolivarian joint criminal enterprise is in tackling the network's diversified criminal portfolio and global reach. We examine only 5 of the many criminal typologies under which the group engages, including fictitious oil sales and loans, physical asset purchases, fictitious state mega-infrastructure projects, illegal gold mining, and bank-to-bank transfers. Actions like designating PDVSA, the now national oil company of Venezuela, and senior leaders are critical. However, the network's ability to adapt and diversify their criminal portfolio means that the money will continue to flow into the regime's coffers. Criminal typologies. PDVSA, the now nationalized oil company of Venezuela, issues false sales of subsidized oil to its state-owned subsidiaries in Central America. Those subsidiaries falsify profits from PDVSA oil sales to insert dirty cash into company accounts. These subsidiaries direct falsified loans to a network of shell companies. The shell companies default on the loans, transferring the loan cash to private bank accounts abroad. Falsified oil sales. Falsified oil sales schemes are the foundation upon which the Bolivian joint criminal enterprise began. Venezuela's PDVSA is a majority shareholder in several regional oil subsidiaries through its PDV Carib branch. PDV Carib owns 60% of Alba Petrolos in El Salvador and 51% of Albanesia in Nicaragua. The Venezuelan company's control of each company involved in the Alba Consortium allows for funds to move through the Venezuelan company to its Central American subsidiaries with ease. Moreover, the sums of money moving through PDV Carib are significant. Other interviews with individuals close to Alba Petrolos found that the subsidiary received virtually no oil from PDVSA between 2010 and 2017, yet the Salvadorian subsidiary recorded incomes of approximately $200 million a year, totaling around $1.2 billion through that examined time frame. In Nicaragua, Albanesia did receive some oil from PDVSA, but the Nicaraguan subsidiary still received funds far outvaluing the imports. In Albanesia's case, the money provided totaled $400 million to $600 million a year, or $4 billion to $6 billion in illicit funds over the past decade. These slush funds were handled by a small number of political elites, even though the funds accounted for between 16 and 20% of the national budget in Nicaragua and 50% of El Salvador budget each year. Yet the funds never passed through a congressional budget allocation process or any accountability mechanism. To create a corresponding paper trail, both Alba Petrolos and Albanesia established dozens of front companies and enterprises, investing heavily, at least on paper, in food production, financial institutions, airlines, think tanks, alternative energy projects, land acquisitions, gasoline stations, and other activities. All of these companies reportedly operated under the Alba banner and included interlocking corporate directorships too seldom meeting the legal requirements for financial reporting. In both cases, interlocking networks of political party stalwarts, senior government officials, and PDVSA officials run the subsidiary agencies. Most notably, though, most of the projects that the oil companies claim to fund do not physically exist or produce any goods or services whatsoever. In the case of Alba Petrolos, José Luis Morano, El Salvador's Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs for Investment and Financial Development and former FMLN commander, and a few other trusted frontmen and straw owners then set up a series of companies with interlocking ownership structures in Panama. From there, Alba Petrolos and its related companies loaned 8 Panamanian companies under their control at least $1.1 billion between 2007 and 2017. These companies in turn moved the money to financial safe havens in the Caribbean and Europe, including the British Virgin Islands, the Cayman Islands, Belize, Switzerland, and Russia. Finally, they declared most of the debts unrecoverable. In Nicaragua's case, Albanesia's funds are not as well traced because the Ortega regime systematically failed to file the required information and allowed only a few trusted people access to the financial records. However, the investigative website Confidential and other investigators documented parts of the structure which used similar methods to create dozens of fund companies, including a bank, which will be discussed later in the report, for Albanesia to store funds while moving the money offshore. Another criminal typology. The PDVSA, the now national Venezuelan oil company, authorizes the purchase of equipment using state funds. PDVSA routes funds for equipment to front companies in the United States and Panama. Front companies use allocated funds to purchase high-value assets such as mansions, yachts, and private aircraft. Front companies transfer these said high-value assets to corrupt PDVSA officials and the Venezuelan political elite. On August 16, 2018, Venezuelan news broadcasting owner Raul Gorin was charged with conspiracy to violate the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the FCPA, conspiracy to commit money laundering, and money laundering. Gorin pleaded guilty to all charges. This case serves as one example of how a fixed asset scheme can launder Venezuelan state funds out of the country and into financial safe havens, or otherwise desirable third country locations. In the Bolivarian joint criminal enterprise, the final destination of fixed asset practices is often the United States. In total, 12 conspirators were named in the complaint for a foreign currency exchange system scheme where the Venezuelan bolivar currency was traded for a fixed U.S. dollar price significantly higher than the official exchange rate. The scheme allegedly laundered between $1.2 and $2.4 billion through the U.S. financial system over the course of 4 years. Gorin's participation in the scheme totaled about U.S. $159 million. While this scheme began only in 2014, Gorin's involvement dates back to 2008 when he first began paying bribes to retain business contracts. As he was a trusted partner for corrupt Venezuelan officials, Gorin paid bribes and laundered funds over at least the last decade through PDVSA bank accounts that could operate in dollars without being subject to exchange controls or banking restrictions. The exchange rate manipulation criminal typology gave regime insiders access to scarce dollars at highly preferential rates. Those involved were then instructed to take the dollars out of Venezuela, often disguised as funds for imports or earnings from exports. The exchange controls for normal citizens was necessary because unprecedented inflation made the local currency, the bolivar, worth less every day, and the regime was desperate to collect as many dollars or anything other than bolivars. Much of this money first moved through the United States into Switzerland and then back to the United States. To conceal the origins of the funds, Gorin moved money through front companies, including acquiring the Dominican bank Banco Pavera to conceal the origins of the funds. From there, Gorin obscured the origin of the laundered funds through real estate investments or the purchases of other fixed, tangible assets. The indictment found that among the purchases that Gorin made with laundered funds, he purchased approximately 3 jets, a yacht, multiple champion horses, and numerous high-end watches. As the funds were no longer in cash or in otherwise traceable form, the laundering scheme was more difficult to detect than if the monies continued moving through banks or observable financial transactions. As a result of his guilty plea, in November 2018, at least 24 of Gorin's properties located in the states of New York and Florida were seized. The 7 condominiums in New York alone have an estimated value of $40 million. Authorities also seized 17 prize horses and several luxury vehicles. In this case, as in most instances of this criminal typology, Gorin was one of the multiple participants, each carrying out one part of a larger whole. This continues to serve as a common criminal typology in several countries for the Bolivarian joint criminal enterprise. Another criminal typology from the Bolivian joint criminal enterprise: illegal gold mining. Gold smugglers, criminal organizations, mine illegal gold, smuggling it through complicit states such as Venezuela. Refineries provide false documentation for the gold, allowing it to be sold on the international market. Relabeled gold is sold on the international market for cash. Purchasers remit payments for the illegal gold back to the criminal organizations through anonymized funds. In recent years, the Bolivarian joint criminal enterprise has diversified their operations into illicit gold mining industry for profit and as a way to launder the proceeds of multiple illicit revenue streams through an underregulated industry. This is to say that the enterprise's decision to mine gold is at least in part due to the high prices of gold on the international market, the ease with which gold can be moved and converted to cash, and the low risk of detection for illegal gold transactions. The clearest example of the illicitly mined gold scheme in relation to this criminal enterprise is the Kalati Suriname Mint House, KSMH, operating near Paramaribo, Suriname. Integrated in 2015, the company maintains a partnership between Suriname and Kalati Precious Metals of the United Arab Emirates. The KSMH operates under the protection of the President Desi Boutrous, a convicted cocaine trafficker, longtime weapons supplier to the FARC, and an individual who was elected with financial support from Chavez. KSMH, an economically irrational, largely fictitious project that on paper costs $20 million, is in the most isolated country in the hemisphere. There is no competitive advantage to gold dealers from gold-producing countries who all ship their gold to Miami or Europe on a daily direct commercial flights. Yet while Suriname produces roughly 28 tons of gold a year, the refinery was to have the capacity to refine 60 tons of gold. Multiple site visits in June 2016 to the KSMH in the town of Whitsunday near the country's one international airport found that no such refinery existed. In fact, the building that reportedly housed the project gave no indication of commercial activities whatsoever. Interviews with gold dealers in Suriname confirmed the lack of a refinery. What makes the KSMH so valuable is the ease with which the Bolivarian joint criminal enterprise can export their gold as originating in Suriname, disguising the real origin of the metal and avoiding scrutiny and sanctions. The gold moving through KSMH is unlikely to be legally produced in other South American countries, but is ideal for accommodating illicit flows of resources and the accompanying laundering. In addition, IBI consultant fieldwork found that KSMH, now officially charged with certifying Suriname's gold exports, likely also exports non-existent gold, certifying exports without any gold actually being moved. In practice, then, one can obtain a certificate of gold exports from Suriname without having to export any gold, creating a mechanism for justifying cash deposits that would otherwise be suspect. As the movement of the Bolivarian funds are under scrutiny, the Maduro regime is an even more popular choice of activity to acquire cash that would otherwise be blocked by financial sanctions. In 2018 alone, the Venezuelan state sold 73.2 tons of gold in Turkey and the United Arab Emirates, with some of the gold ending up as far away as Uganda. Given that the Venezuelan Central Bank's gold reserves grew by 11 tons in 2018 despite the ongoing sell-off, it is likely that a significant amount of the commodity was mined illegally by dissident groups of the FARC and the ELN. The sale of illegally mined gold, diamonds, coltan, and other easy-to-distribute commodities that are otherwise difficult to trace are an increasingly important criminal typology for the Bolivarian joint criminal enterprise. Falsified infrastructure projects. The PDVSA, the now national oil company of Venezuela, issues contracts for refineries and other infrastructure which never materialize. Money from PDVSA contracts is issued as payment for non-existent products. Funds for the false projects are routed through front companies who provide a clean money trail. Through false invoices or salary payments, public funds are integrated into private bank accounts. The transfer of large sums of state money through non-existent infrastructure projects is an important methodology used by criminalized states to launder funds. Because the state allocates the funds towards these projects and controls the state's investigative bodies, oversight and accountability by state watchdogs are non-existent. Neither PDVSA nor its Central American subsidiaries could be investigated by tax auditors, law enforcement, or financial control entities because all were under the control of the state whose leaders allowed the operation to go forward and who benefited themselves from the activities. As this criminal typology has been perfected over time, this is now one of the most effective and least risky methodologies for the Bolivarian joint criminal enterprise to use. One of the largest of these cases was the signature program announced between Albanese and PDVSA in Nicaragua. In 2007, President Chavez and Ortega jointly laid the ceremonial stone when Nicaragua was to build a large oil refinery to refine PDVSA's heavy crude petroleum. The presidents announced the project would cost an estimated $6.6 billion, an absurd and economically irrational amount of money for such a venture. Grandly named the Supreme Dream of Bolivar, Supremo Sueño de Bolivar, the refinery on paper received an initial $32 million in startup funding in 2008 and an additional $60 million over the following 3 years. In 2012 and 2013, the program received an additional $341.2 million. Since 2013, the exact sum of money dedicated to this project is not known, but the Venezuelan and Nicaraguan governments apportioned several tens of millions of dollars through 2015 at the point the financial paper trail ended. Yet the nearly $500 million in paper investments that have already moved through this project have left few visible results. Multiple site visits between 2014 and 2016 found only an empty field with a few storage tanks and a sagging wooden fence, with no signs of a refinery other than a few rusting storage tanks. In reality, the criminalized financial chain moved the funds from PDVSA through its Albanese subsidiary and then redistributed the funds as payments for non-existent work and materials to a series of contracting companies linked to Ortega and Chavez governments. These fund companies then moved the now untraceable clean money back into control of Nicaraguan and Venezuelan criminal structures. While the refinery was one of the largest fictitious state-to-state infrastructure projects uncovered in our field research, it was just one of the dozens of similar enterprises that ultimately laundered hundreds of millions of dollars through the support of the Bolivian joint criminal enterprise. Other large projects included contracts for oil drilling that never took place, the construction of a vaccination plant that never produced a vaccine, a solar panel that produced no panels, a water bottling company that produced no bottled water, and dozens of other enterprises throughout the region. This continues to be one of the most frequently used criminal typologies by the enterprise today. Bank-to-bank transfers. Public officials deposit dirty funds into a friendly local bank where it is mixed with other transactions. The local bank routes cash through the correspondent banks, often to shell corporations in offshore havens. Cash transfers are deposited into private accounts at friendly banks registered to shell corporations and sanitized. Corrupt officials withdraw money from offshore accounts through fake business transactions, disguising the origins of their wealth. The final criminal typology explored in this report are bank-to-bank transfers. By early 2014, the flow of illicit funds flowing through the PDVSA, the now nationalized oil company of Venezuela, network was at its peak. This flood of cash began to overwhelm the PDVSA Central American structure, and the physical amount of dollar bills in circulation made layering the money in traditional banking structures almost impossible, at least without setting off alarms. This abundance of resources forced the enterprise to opt for a bold solution available to states engaging in criminal activities. Nicaragua created their own bank under Nicaraguan state protection. This bank was controlled by President Ortega and overseen by his most trusted financial associates who already controlled the Albanesia consortium. In October 2014, Nicaraguan authorities officially registered Banco Cooperative, Bancorp, as a financial entity, co-locating the bank in the same offices as Albanesia. The bank's inaugural statement said the institution would specialize in trusts and money management services, and local news outlets reported the bank was owned by Albanesia. Yet the bank carried out few normal banking activities, opting not to offer checking accounts, loans, or mortgages among their repertoire of financial tools. However, Bancorp did host a $1.5 billion trust from Albanesia and related companies and $1 billion in other trusts. This newly minted financial institution's activities appeared so unusual that the leaders of Nicaragua's established banking sector met with U.S. Embassy officials to emphasize their professional distance from the Bancorp entity. Concerns grew when Bancorp received $16 million in cash deposits in the month of December of 2016 alone. Alarms were set off, though, when the bank declared that its deposits grew to $340 million in 2017, a 237% increase from the year before, despite a lack of clients or clear business activity. One of Bancorp's most significant anomalies, though, is its lack of correspondent banking relationships with any bank with access to the U.S. financial system. In essence, this cuts the bank off from the ability to carry out business in most of the world. IBI Consultants' field research found that Bancorp was a workaround to move the money out of Nicaragua, opened an account in a Panama branch of an Asian bank with branches in Hong Kong, South Korea, and Panama. Funds from the Bolivian joint criminal enterprise were then transferred from Nicaragua into Bancorp's account with the Asia Bank in Panama, before ultimately landing in the Hong Kong branch. In Hong Kong, funds were sanitized and layered into different accounts controlled by Ortega and his allies. Money could then easily be moved from Hong Kong and wired anywhere in the world, including the United States. This bank-to-bank transfer mechanism then changed in January 2019 when the United States sanctioned Bancorp. In response, President Ortega then opted for his most bold option yet, at least regarding banking. He fast-tracked a legislative proposal through Nicaragua's National Assembly, controlled by Ortega's FSLN party, for the Nicaraguan state to buy Bancorp for about $23 million and convert it into Nicaragua's central bank. The move passed, thus amalgamating Bancorp's existing funds and making it more difficult to identify and cut off the flow of illicit monies in Nicaragua's banking system. Human and economic impact. The human costs of the Bolivarian joint criminal enterprises across nations are brutal, but at least to some extent measurable. In 2018, Venezuela's inflation rate surpassed 1 million%, and the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, estimates this rate to soar past 10 million% by the end of 2019. Moreover, a 2017 Venezuelan study estimated the average Venezuelan citizen lost 24.1 pounds that year, given the country's food shortages. Finally, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the IAHCR, estimated that only 20% of the needed medicines needed were still readily accessible to Venezuelans in 2018. The systematic lack of food and medicine are just two types of humanitarian rights abuses committed by the Maduro regime. Widespread and increasing U.S. sanctions against Venezuela's state companies and associated individuals have been blamed by some for the humanitarian catastrophe. However, the effects of these actions on the average Venezuelan have likely been marginal. Estimates on sanctions damage towards the Venezuelan people are scarce, but one estimate found that between September 2017 and September 2018, U.S. sanctions resulted in approximately $6 billion in Venezuelan losses. The effects accelerated since January 19, when the U.S. announced sanctions against PDVSA, the now nationalized oil company. However, S&P Global estimates that this action cut Venezuelan crude production by more than 50% in February, a loss of about $6 million in revenue per day. While significant, these losses are marginal to the costs explored in this section. Moreover, such revenues would likely be distributed among the political elites, whose support is vital to the Maduro regime, not to the Venezuelan people. In short, the regime's systematic looting and mismanagement brought the formal economy to its knees, not targeted sanctions, Mr. Jimmy Dore. A possible metric of the crisis is through the refugee exodus and the costs associated with forced migration. Beginning in 2014, shortly after Maduro's election, an exodus of refugees left Venezuela primarily to regional neighbors. The United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees, UNHCR, estimates that by January 2019, at least 3.4 million Venezuelan refugees, or 10.5% of Venezuela's population as measured in 2014, lived outside their country. This makes Venezuela's refugee crisis the largest mass forced migration in the history of Latin America, and on par or much to exceed Syrian refugees' flows in the coming years. Colombia is the most affected by the crisis in sheer numbers. The UNHCR estimates that prior to the border between Colombia and Venezuela closing in late February 2019, some 5,000 Venezuelans entered Colombia every day. The other countries that are most affected by sheer refugee flow numbers are Peru and Ecuador. While Venezuela's western neighbors are hosting more refugees in raw numbers, some of the smallest countries in the Western Hemisphere host proportionally more refugees compared to their populations. Curacao hosts 16,147 per 100,000 Venezuelan refugees, which is approximately 8 times higher than Colombia. Aruba follows closely at 15,200. And the third country, most proportionally affected country, is Venezuela's eastern neighbor, Guyana, with 4,500. The Venezuelan refugee crisis affects the entire hemisphere and should therefore be considered when analyzing the broader costs of the crisis. The UNHCR is requesting $201 million for refugee resettlement costs. The United Nations is requesting an additional $738 million in humanitarian aid for 2019. It is reasonable to assume that humanitarian aid and resettlement costs associated with the Venezuelan crisis will be at least $1.5 billion. Another set of costs associated with the crisis is the external debt owed by Venezuela to foreign countries and international organizations, which will have to be repaid with interest. As of early 2019, Venezuela owed China roughly $20 billion. They owed Russia's state-owned oil company Rosneft approximately $2.3 billion. Other estimates suggest that Venezuela's total outstanding external debt is about $100 billion. As a result, we contend that Venezuela's debt equals between $22.3 billion and $100 billion. A third set of cost estimates we previously mentioned are the funds laundered by the Bolivarian joint criminal enterprise, which we estimate to be $10 billion between 2007 and 2018. This is a low-range estimate compared to a recent report estimating $28 billion. One person interviewed for this report, who was directly involved in the movement of PDVSA funds, estimated the figure is closer to $43 billion. We therefore estimate between $10 and $43 billion in state funds were siphoned out of Venezuela's. Finally, according to Venezuela's National Assembly, which is run by the opposition, Venezuela's economy shrank by 53% between 2013 and 2019. We're recognizing that these losses are likely reported with bias and are imprecise. It is possible to approximate economic losses based on Venezuela's previous GDP output. In 2013, Venezuela's economy generated approximately $381 billion in GDP. Assuming an average 8 to 8.5% decline in GDP per year since 2013, Venezuela lost between $411 and $434 billion in GDP from 2013 through 2018. This estimate more strongly favors the position of Venezuela's opposition, but it serves as an approximation on economic losses given the lack of official government reporting. Some of the costs incurred by the Bolivarian joint criminal enterprise in Venezuela's subsequent economic decline resulted in costs between $473 billion and $633 billion since Maduro took office in 2013. As a result, the Venezuelan political elite's actions created a spiraling effect with the severe secondary and tertiary financial effects on the Venezuelan population. The estimates of Venezuela's crisis are both incomplete and imprecise, but they do demonstrate the magnitude of the Venezuela situation. Moreover, much of the actions and subsequent results would not have been possible without the assistance of a much broader network of illicit actors operating in positions of power from around the world. In conclusion, this report highlights the interconnectedness of different actors and economic mechanisms that facilitate the enterprise's endurance, albeit currently in a weakened state. The Bolivarian Joint Criminal Enterprise is a unique structure built on direct state participation in criminal behavior operating across multiple economic spheres and enforcement jurisdictions. This criminal portfolio draws on support from state entities, illicit business, and organized criminal groups. The result is a complex criminal operation that undermines the rule of law, democratic governance, and U.S. alliance throughout the Western Hemisphere. The Bolivarian structure has proven to be resilient and adaptable with multiple redundant capabilities. Operationally, when one facet of the criminal network is pressured, the Bolivarian Joint Criminal Enterprise is adept at shifting operations to new areas or finding new allies, often feeding off the different strengths and connections of the enterprise's shared history and common goals. The U.S. government has recently undertaken a more holistic and unified effort to confront these criminal actors, yielding significant results. Efforts to channel some of the funds flowing from PDVSA, the now nationalized oil company, and the Bolivarian banking structure to the legitimately recognized Guaido government and out of the hands of the Maduro regime are innovative and necessary. But as former U.S. Southcom Commander Admiral James Stavridis said, it takes a network to fight a network. The key to combating this network, we argue, is the integrating of the authorities and capabilities across the U.S. government and in collaboration with trusted partners like Colombia to tackle the Bolivarian network's reach. This approach includes combining the resources and authorities of the Departments of Treasury, State, Justice, Homeland Security, and Defense, along with the intelligence community, to confront multiple nodes of the enterprise. However, tackling the Bolivarian Joint Criminal Enterprise also requires response to actors in countries beyond Venezuela, and to embracing a more robust long-term engagement with politically aligned partner nations in the Western Hemisphere. As the Bolivarian revolution ideological drives have been largely discredited, this is an opportunity for the United States to boldly engage the region and to tackle the reach and complexity that this criminal enterprise encompasses.